I continue to read the biography of Isaiah Berlin, A Life, by Michael Ignatieff, Chapter 14, Late Awakening. In June 1949, he passed a gloomy 40th birthday at Harvard. It was a dreadful hump to cross, he confessed. He found it difficult to admit that he had actually become an adult. I cannot quite think of myself as on the side of authority, judgment, etc. And I hear myself chatter, and the only excuse for it is that one is full of unsifted ideas, and two, check a blog to have time to think, and too warm-blooded to reckon the consequences and so on. And this is absurd when one is viewed as an old bachelor. Despite a frantically busy social life, darting down on the train to society dinners in London, he was unsettled and late at night. When he returned to his rooms at New College, he was often lonely. He told close friends that he wanted to get married, but they found the idea hard to imagine. He seemed to take no interest in their children, lacked the most elementary domestic skills, and still remained tied to his parents. He celebrated the Jewish high holidays with them, visited them in Holycroft Avenue, Hampstead, whenever he was in London, and even took holidays in French hotels and German spas in their company. Oxford colleges have always served as homes for permanently arrested adolescents. Safe in their embrace, he might well have remained a sexless don. But he knew this was no solution. His relationship with Patricia Douglas had ignited strong, if unconsumed, longings, and he knew that flight into monastic seclusion was out of the question. She continued her infuriating and inflaming dance with him for well over 4 years after the war. When he was in Moscow, she wrote longing letters, coquettishly scolding him for wrapping himself in the mystery of Russia. When he returned, he found that she was deep in some new affair. They would make plans to go to the music festival in Aix-en-Provence, and then she would fail to show up. As she careered in and out of affairs and marriages, now in Paris, now in Ireland, he would receive plenty of letters that made her seem irresistible. But when they were together, she would soon flee to a man who was more confidently sexual. The situation became intolerable, and he found that he could only keep his balance by refusing to see her. His emotional state in this period is laid bare by his translation of Ivan Turgenev's First Love. It is the story of a boy's awakening to love, told in retrospect by a sadder and older man. In order to test his renderings into English, Isaiah enlisted the help of a beautiful friend, Shirley Morgan, then working at the Foreign Office. There are photographs of the two of them lounging on the Oxford River bank or in the pond, Shirley in a light cotton print dress, Isaiah heavy-set and formal in a three-piece suit, with a Hershey chocolate bar raised to cover his face from the photographer. With Shirley, Isaiah played the cool as usual, listening to the stories of her suitors, who included Freddie Ayer, whom he had warned her against, and the Marquis of Anglesey, whom she eventually married. Since first love was a tender study of infatuation, its translation provided Isaiah with an indirect means of exploring his own feelings for Patricia. Was it right, he asked Shirley, to say that your heart turned over when your loving glance was first returned? Or should he say that the heart slipped its moorings? Well, at Harvard, Isaiah actually consulted Vladimir Nabokov, then a research fellow in Lepidoptera at the Harvard Zoology Department, on how to translate this particular passage. Nabokov's suggestion, my heart went pit-a-pat. My heart went pit-a-pat, left Isaiah unimpressed. Finally, he settled on, my heart leaped within me. First love tells the story of an adolescent swept into love and into adulthood by the force of his unrequited passion for a young woman who is older and more experienced than himself. As the story progresses, the young man discovers why the woman, Zenaida, refuses the deeper commitment he longs for. She is in fact in love with an older man. In the climatic scenes, he discovered who this older man is. One night, hidden in the shadow, he watches Zenaida and the man alone at an open window. They are talking when suddenly the boys realize that the man is his father. He then watches in horror as his father raises his horse whip and strikes her bare arm. The watching boy's shock is intense. It was all I could do to prevent myself from crying out. Zenaida quivered, looked silently at my father, and raising her arm slowly to her lips, kissed the scar which glowed crimson upon it. This is an unforgettable image of love in its maddest intensity. Isaiah's identification was with the watching boy, with his choked sense of being still trapped in adolescence, able to watch but not to take part or even fully understand the passion of adults. It's not too much to say that first love expresses all the anguish that he had felt years earlier in the New York hotel, listening to Patricia and her love on the other side of the partition wall. The first edition of the translation, when it appeared in 1950, was dedicated to her. But it was a bitter kind of a parting gift, for by then he knew that the affair was hopeless. In subsequent editions, he removed the inscription to PDB, Patricia de Burden, from the dedication page. His experience with Patricia might have confirmed him or imprisoned him in the role of the sexless bachelor, but instead of marking the end of his erotic life, it was the beginning, for he fell out of love with Patricia in the most efficient of all available ways, by falling in love with someone else. His choice was surprising. A married woman with children, whom he had known since the 1930s. She was a vivacious, attractive, highly intelligent woman of strong political opinions, who had briefly been a communist before the war. Her marriage was enduring but unhappy. She was married to a brilliant, abstracted, and otherworldly Don. She was adventurous in her sexual life, and one might have expected that it was she who took the initiative. But this was not the case. He took to his bed with a cold, in midsummer 1950, and when she came to take care of him, she put her down onto the bed. She was astonished and then moved that he could display such feelings. For him, the experience undammed a reservoir. The change was complete. At the relatively ripe old age of 41, he had begun adult sexual life. They started an intense affair in his college rooms, in her house, in fields and churchyards around Oxford, and on one occasion, during their absence, in his parents' house in Hampstead. They had some close scripts, colleges, children, and friends all came with the interest of discovering them. But Isaiah seemed to relish the danger. He was a naive rather than a sentimental lover, eager rather than accomplished, but capable, so she discovered, of intense physical tenderness. Behind the protective screen of a brilliant talk, there was a capacity for intimacy that perhaps not even he had suspected. Isaiah never asked her to leave her husband, knowing that she would probably have refused. Very soon, however, he decided that he must tell him of his feelings. It must have been an excruciating moment. They were close friends, and the man in question was a decency personified. "I'm in love with your wife," Isaiah blurted out, to which the husband replied, "That's not possible." So the affair continued, but Isaiah felt compelled to repeat his confession. And this time the husband came home, so she remembers, shaking his head and saying, "Isaiah keeps going mad. He says again he's in love with you." Before the war, Berlin had been censorious about the betrayals and the subterfuges of his friends. By his own admission, he had been priggish in matters of personal relations. Now he was engaged in duplicities he had been quick to reprove in others. The experience knocked some of the priggishness out of him, made him less quick to judge and blame, more respectful of the tidal power of feelings, and more aware of the frailty of the locks and dams built to keep the tide in check. The affair continued for several years, but Berlin's affections slowly began to transfer towards another woman, also married to an Oxford colleague, also with children. Ellen Houben was a slim, supportive, and aristocratic French woman in her late 30s. Born into a distinguished section of the Jewish community of Paris, her father was Baron Pierre de Gusenberg, the Russian-born son of Baron Horace Gosberg, an illustrious banker and a philanthropist of pre-revolutionary St. Petersburg. Her father had settled in Paris and had married the daughter of a Jewish family from Alsace, who had made their fortune in heating oil. Ellen grew up in a large family mansion in the Avenue de Lena in the 16th arrondissement. It was a significantly less observant Jewish household than Isaiah's. Ellen grew up as an assimilated Parisian, conscious of her Russian and Jewish origins, but fundamentally French in language, culture, and outlook. Her shattered life was rudely shattered just before the war by the death in quick succession of her sister, a brother, and her young husband. At the age of 24, she was a widow with an infant son. Then the war came and the entire basis of French-Jewish assimilation collapsed with the defeat of France. In 1940, she fled south to escape the Germans, lodging first in Biarritz and then in Nice. When the Vichy regime published its anti-Jewish edicts, she determined to escape and in early 1941 managed to reach New York via a boat from Lisbon with her son, soon followed by her parents. On that boat had been Isaiah on his way to his posting in New York. He had noticed the tall, elegant, shy woman and had wondered who she was. They met again during the war in New York through the auspices of the Rothschilds at a house in the Hamptons on Long Island. She was there to play golf with Cecil Rothschild. He thought with a certain friction that she cut a fine figure. She was considerably less impressed, couldn't follow what Isaiah said, couldn't make out his age, and thought he looked dumpy and unprepossessing in a crumpled white suit. They met again at the Hotel Pierre in New York sometime later, and the same pattern repeated itself. She barely noticed him. In 1943, she met Hans Hauben, a physicist of Austrian extraction who had worked on the French nuclear program and had escaped to America in 1940, carrying with him important information about the production of heavy water, a component in the manufacture of atomic weapons. He was then working on secret research for the Manhattan Project. They were married and went to Montreal, where he directed a research laboratory for the duration of the war. In 1946, as Isaiah was about to leave America to return to Oxford, he met Ellen again. Her marriage seemed to have crushed her. The accomplished and stylish woman he had met in 1942 was now meek, submissive, and obviously unhappy, though she said nothing about it. Hans Hauben was invited to take up a post in Oxford, and when they moved there in 1946, Isaiah became part of their life, taking Ellen to concerts, dining at their house, and gradually becoming a family friend. She felt at ease with him. He made her laugh and provided her with a safe and blameless escape from a marriage that was becoming more difficult by the year. In 1949, when he went to Harvard, she was on the same boat heading to visit her mother, and they spent 10 happy days together on a crossing, which included Marietta and Ronald Trey and other friends. The trip became an adventure. The ship ran around off Cherbourg, and they didn't reach New York until 12 days later. It was on board ship that they became inseparable friends. Yet even at this period, while she was increasingly unhappy in her marriage, the thought did not cross her mind that Isaiah might be a possible partner. The thought obviously never occurred to Hans Hauben, who let her drive him across France to the X Festival in the summer of 1952. By mid-1953, Ellen was coming to Isaiah's rooms almost every day to work with him on a French translation of The Hedgehog and the Fox. Then, just in the process of appearing in the Weidenfeld and Nicholson edition, Weidenfeld had been shrewd enough to see the commercial potential locked up in an obscure essay, Lev Tolstoy's Historical Skepticism, which Isaiah had published in Oxford Slavonic Papers in 1951. By retitling it The Hedgehog and the Fox and putting it out for a general readership with additions by Isaiah, Weidenfeld did more for Isaiah's public reputation than any other publisher. The essay concluded with the most memorable image of a human anguish in Berlin's writings, his picture of a Tolstoy at Astapovo. It was insanely proud and filled with hatred, omniscient and doubting everything, cold and violently passionate, contemptuous and self-abasing, tormented and detached, surrounded by an adoring family, by devoted followers, by the admiration of the entire civilized world, and yet almost wholly isolated. He is the most tragic of the great writers, a desperate old man, beyond human aid, wandering self-blinded at Klonos. As Alan and Isaiah worked together on the translation of this, the most compelling of all his essays, they came still closer together. He was spontaneous and phenomenally agile of mind, but also affectionate and full of life. She felt that her early death of her sister, her husband, and a brother who died as a young conscript before the war had left her frozen. Isaiah seemed capable of thawing her out. But still, she could see how different they were. Despite a common Jewishness, she was a Parisian French and aristocratic, he a Russian Jew from the commercial classes. As she once said, I was Western Europe, he was Eastern Europe. He could sense that she was withdrawn, that she had developed a protective shell. He called her the Odalisque, ambiguous compliment, which praised her beauty while expressing perplexity at her melancholy passivity. As he wrote to a friend, I like her very much. She's beautifully bred and altogether charming, and lives in a curiously detached way in Oxford, to which she does not belong in any sense, and which she reacts to a half-sleepwalking fashion. Let me stop here as it's too long.